Good evening, everybody. I'm David Asman, sitting in for the vacationing Lou Dobbs. We begin this evening with the latest in the battle for the White House. The Republican Party in Arizona today announced plans to bring forward a case before the Supreme Court in support of President Trump. Arizona Republicans say they will appeal an election integrity case that was dismissed earlier this week by the state Supreme Court. As that case is drawn up, President Trump and his legal team are eagerly awaiting an order from the Supreme Court on another lawsuit brought forward by the state of Texas. Now, this lawsuit seeks to challenge the election results in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Georgia. For the very latest, we turn to Fox News correspondent Kevin Corke in Washington. Hi, Kevin.
Evening, David. And I can tell you that there are actually more names now that have been added to the list of Republicans signing on to an amicus brief that, if successful, would in fact overturn the results of the 2020 election. House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy among those now signing on. The California Republican, along with 19 of his colleagues, have been added to that brief. In total, 126 GOP members from the House have added their names to the brief. Let me take you to Twitter. Representative Mike Johnson, who actually originally filed the brief, then recruited his Republican colleagues to sign on to it, posted on Twitter today that 20 names would have been included on the brief on Thursday, but for a, quote, clerical error. And another big name I can tell you about tonight, Georgia Representative Doug Collins is also on that list. There are a few other high-profile names still missing, like Devin Nunes and Liz Cheney, but we'll see if that changes in the days to come. Texas, as you know, claims that coronavirus-related changes to each state's election procedures violated the Constitution. Texas's AG, Ken Paxton, who filed the lawsuit, says Texas has standing because the folks in his state didn't have their voices heard because other state elections were not conducted properly. So far, as you mentioned, 17 other states have filed a brief in support of the Texas lawsuit. Now, to be fair, critics have called this suit unserious from the very outset, with Pennsylvania's state attorney general calling the suit a, quote, seditious abuse of the judicial process. But backers, David, say this is precisely the venue where this case needs to be heard, and we'll see how it all plays out in the days ahead. David?
By the way, these critics were the same people who were saying there was nothing to the Hunter Biden story, so take that with a grain of salt. Kevin Corke reporting. Thank you, Kevin. Good to see you, my friend. While the battle for the White House continues, there are new details emerging about the federal investigation into Joe Biden's son, Hunter Biden. The Wall Street Journal reporting Attorney General William Barr knew about numerous investigations into Hunter Biden's overseas business dealings since at least last spring. Now, Barr worked to keep the probes out of public view during the election to avoid politicizing the DOJ, according to the story in the Wall Street Journal. A spokeswoman for the Attorney General declined to comment, but Congressman Andy Biggs, the head of the House Freedom Caucus, says Barr's actions ultimately hurt President Trump. Listen.
AG Barr, I mean, the excuse will be, hey, look, we didn't want to influence the election. Well, you know what you did? You influenced the election by suppressing very important investigations that were going on that you've been doing for a long time. How long did the FBI have that laptop for Hunter Biden? About a year now. Why did they suppress it? What were they doing? Why did we not know any of this? Why wasn't Congress given that information so we could conduct investigations and hearings?
In a tweet, President Trump questioned, quote, why didn't the fake news media, the FBI, and the DOJ report the Biden matter before the election? This is a question that many of us have been asking. The Daily Beast today provided an incredible answer. They wrote that evidence of an investigation into Hunter Biden was, quote, apparent in the markings on a series of documents that were made public but went largely unnoticed in the days leading up to the November election. Now, the corporate-owned media, of course, was all too willing to allow the Hunter Biden report to go, quote, largely unnoticed. They said nothing as the story was censored entirely by social media giants Facebook and Twitter, two companies that still refuse to answer for their role in interfering in the election. Then, of course, there were the likes of the Washington Post columnist Greg Sargent. He called the New York Post bombshell reports on Hunter Biden's laptop, quote, Trump's fake new Biden scandal. Politico published a letter signed by 50 former intel officials who said the report was, quote, Russian disinformation. Obviously, with no evidence to support their theme. Now, the letter was signed by none other than John Brennan and James Clapper. These were the very same people who actually used Russian disinformation to try and bring down President Trump in 2016. There was also NPR's managing editor Terrence Samuels, who arrogantly announced, quote, "We don't want to waste our time on stories that are not really stories, and we don't want to waste the listeners' and readers' time on stories that are just pure distractions." Sounds like it's right out of the Kremlin. Now, the dismissal of the Biden corruption scandal still continues to this day. Fox News was the only outlet to ask Joe Biden today about the scandal. Biden would only say he is, quote, proud of his son. Now, we will be taking up the coordinated effort to hide the Biden corruption scandal with a great lineup of guests this evening. We're joined by Just the News editor-in-chief, John Solomon. He has been reporting and has new reports about Hunter Biden's business deals in Ukraine. Judicial Watch President Tom Fitton is with us to take up why the DOJ kept the investigation under wraps for so long. We're also joined by Congressman Devin Nunes on what Congress is doing in the battle for the White House. And Pastor Jeffress is also with us later in the broadcast. Turning now to promising developments from Operation Warp Speed, Health and Human Services Secretary Alex Azar today said the first China virus vaccinations in the United States could be given out as early as the beginning of next week. Azar says the FDA is on the verge of approving Pfizer's vaccine for emergency use nationwide. Fox News correspondent Mike Tobin is live outside Pfizer's manufacturing plant in Kalamazoo, Michigan, where I'm sure they're getting ready for distribution. Right, Mike?
They certainly are getting ready en masse. If the approval for the emergency use authorization goes through tonight, if it goes through tomorrow, it's only going to take a short time for millions of doses to start leaving this massive facility here in Kalamazoo, Michigan, another one in Pleasant Prairie, Wisconsin. 2.9 million doses can leave within 24 hours. Half of the doses for the vaccine need to stay here in cold storage, and that is because the Pfizer vaccine requires a follow-up shot. The trials showed that one shot was 50% effective at fighting the virus. The second shot proved 95% effective. Now, as you mentioned, Health and Human Services Secretary Alex Azar said if the EUA is approved on the expected timeline, people could start getting shots in the arm Monday or Tuesday. And other officials say the pandemic isn't over, but there's a light at the end of the tunnel.
Can see the end of the pandemic. It's really in our sight. With 20 million people being able to be vaccinated in December, 30 million in January, and another 50 million in February, just with the two vaccines we know about now, Pfizer and Moderna, we know the end of the pandemic is in sight, but we still have a lot of work to do until most people can get vaccinated and the pandemic goes away.
Now, UPS and FedEx will be handling this very sophisticated ultra-cold shipping chain that will take the vaccine out to all the points of use. Once it is at the points of use, states get control over who gets priority for the vaccination, and the priority generally will be healthcare workers and at-risk population, people like those who are in nursing homes. David?
Good stuff. Mike Tobin reporting. Thank you very much, Mike.
You got it.
Coming up next, is there more tax trouble for Hunter Biden? An email found on his abandoned laptop seems to suggest so. Just the News editor-in-chief John Solomon broke that story, and he joins us after a few quick messages. Stay with us. Is expected to testify in a Michigan State Senate hearing next week. Now, if they show up, it's a big if, that Dominion employee would be the first to answer questions from lawmakers since the November 3rd election. Extraordinary. Also breaking, Just the News, John Solomon reporting that only days before President Trump took office, Hunter Biden was warned that he hadn't paid taxes on $400,000 that he'd made with Burisma. According to an email found on Hunter Biden's laptop, an executive with Biden's Rosemount Seneca advisors emailed him on January 16, 2017, stating, quote, in 2014, you joined the Burisma board, and we still need to amend your 2014 returns to reflect the unreported Burisma income that is approximately $400,000 extra. So your income in 2014 was close to $1,247,000. Joining me now is John Solomon, editor-in-chief of Just the News and best-selling author of Fallout, The Nuclear Bribes, Russian Spies, and the Washington Lies That Enriched the Clinton and Biden Dynasties. which apparently continued, John. You know, there was a time, my friend, when journalists like us would work closely with prosecutors to try to get to the bottom of the story, not just to protect political contacts and people that you favored politically.
So true.
Bob Morgenthau and the Wall Street Journal edit page where I worked, we worked closely on the BCCI story. We brought down that very corrupt bank. Let me just play to you how different things are today. First of all, we're going to list a very suspicious group of quotes from Joe Biden, what he told the press about his son's business dealings. Roll tape, and I'll then play you another one.
No one has indicated of any consequence that anything was done wrong or illegally by me or by my son. My son has not made money in terms of this thing about, what are you talking about? China is a bunch of garbage. Nobody believes it. There's absolutely zero basis to the accusation that I acted any way inappropriately or that my son did. You know there's not one single bit of evidence, not one little tiny bit, to suggest anything done was wrong.
Now, you could see the journalists there kind of nodding. They all accepted this despite the growing amount of evidence and in fact, completely denied the evidence that was beginning to accumulate because of people like you. Let me roll that tape of the journalists. Go ahead.
Charge is so heinous, I'm not even going to say them.
Talking about the Biden's personal corruption, a little bit about Hunter Biden. Most of those charges unverified.
This whole smear.
And the question the media asked him, what kind of ice cream, what flavor ice cream do you have? And he's in the midst of a scandal.
He's not.
And he's taking, of course he is,
no.
Leslie.
Come on.
Come on, man, to quote Joe Biden. I mean, besides people like yourself, is journalism dead?
I'll tell you, curiosity in journalism, at least as it comes to Democrats, seems to be dead. All this time while Joe Biden was making those comments, there were sitting in documents made public by the State Department, clear warnings that Burisma, while Hunter Biden was on the board, made bribe payments. They got referred to the FBI. We knew for a year that this laptop had been given to the FBI in a money laundering and tax case. There was a tax evasion case we now know also underway. The media just didn't want to find this story. It stuck its head in the sand. And now, after the election, it's trying to pay a little bit of dishonest catch-up. But I think the facts are going to continue to come out each and every day. There's more of this onion to peel back. The family of Joe Biden made lots of money following in the vapor trail of his vice presidency, and all of it is going to get detailed before we're done reporting.
Now, since you're one of the few reporters that does things the old-fashioned way, the way that you really do get to more evidence and work with prosecutors and people that are digging up real evidence, not just supposition or covering up for people, what exactly is Hunter being investigated for? There was talk earlier about a money laundering charge that was actually leveled against that Chinese company he was working with, right?
Right, that's right. So there are really three things that have gone on. There was some information that came in regarding the Chinese investments and suspicions of money laundering that began with what are known as suspicious activity reports filed by financial institutions. Money's flowing into companies around Hunter Biden. It looks suspicious. The banks reported under what's known as a SARS. Secondly, this hasn't gotten a lot of attention, but there was a whistleblower in one of these financial institutions that last December 2019, filed whistleblower complaints with the Securities and Exchange Commission and the IRS saying, I believe there were some suspicious activities, maybe some income evasion, tax evasion that was going on in companies around Hunter Biden. And then third, the laptop by that Delaware store owner gets turned over to the FBI. Those three pieces of evidence, my sources tell me, have merged into this tax case that they're now looking at. And I think they're at the end stages of that investigation.
Yeah, but the crux of the matter is, as you say, is when this relationship between Hunter Biden and the Chinese, and we haven't even begun to get into Burisma. We'll talk about that later on in the show. But it began when Joe Biden was vice president of the United States. I know a lot of these emails are 2017 after Trump was elected, but the relationship actually started when Hunter Biden flew on Air Force Two with the vice president, Joe Biden.
Beijing.
He stepped off the plane. The Chinese saw that clearly he was the favored son, literally, of the vice president, and began making deals with him. I mean, this was putting the family reputation of the Bidens in jeopardy. There was no problem with them doing that in order to make a deal with the Chinese.
Yeah, listen, there was no shame. The family was overt in its pursuit of foreign cash on every area where Joe Biden had foreign policy responsibility. That's what's so interesting. Biden's responsibilities were Russia, China, Ukraine. Those are the main ones that he took over in the Obama administration. Where did Hunter Biden and his business associates go looking for money? From a Russian oligarch, a Ukrainian oligarch, and then Chinese businessmen directly tied, according to the Senate report, to the Chinese military. This was an operation, a shakedown operation, I think a lot of people would call it. And for Joe Biden to sit up there and say he didn't make any money, man, this is not right. It's just not true. The tax returns are going to show just how much money Hunter Biden made and also how much money he may have missed paying taxes on.
Follow the money. And, you know, this is cashing in on dealing with the enemy. You think of all of the ways in which China threatens our future existence, from the way they dealt with the COVID pandemic to what they're doing in the South China Sea, to what how they're infiltrating American institutions, and they were trading for the security of the United States so that they could enrich themselves. It's extraordinary. John Solomon, we've got to leave it there, but great reporting. We really appreciate what you're doing. And we would like to hear from you, your thoughts on all of this. Share your comments and follow Lou on Twitter at Lou Dobbs. Like him on Facebook and follow him on Instagram and Parler at Lou Dobbs Tonight. Coming up next, just how much did former Ukraine Ambassador Marie Yovanovitch know about Burisma's corrupt ways? Judicial Watch President Tom Fitton is going to be joining us with what he has learned. And be sure to spread a little Christmas cheer. You can do so by ordering Lou's new book, The Trump Century, at loudobbsshop.com. You can also get an official Lou Dobbs Tonight mug. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back. I'm David Asman, sitting in for the vacationing Lou Dobbs. Well, Judicial Watch has obtained documents from former ambassador to Ukraine, Marie Yovanovitch, in which she warns about the corruption of the Ukrainian gas company Burisma. In a 2017 email, Yovanovitch warned, quote, "I would urge caution in dealing with the Burisma group. It is widely believed that the owner was the beneficiary of the corrupt justice system here," end quote. Now, during last year's sham impeachment proceedings, Yovanovitch said she had little knowledge of Burisma. So there's a little conflict there. Joining me now is Tom Fitton, the president of Judicial Watch. Tom, good to see you. So it appears the ambassador was a lot more familiar with Burisma than she said under oath, right?
Well, that's exactly right. She had a former ambassadorial colleague of hers who was working for the McCain Institute, of all places, run an idea about funding a training for prosecutors in Ukraine, training funded by Burisma.
Ay, ay, ay.
And the ambassador responded appropriately. That's probably not a good idea. And her former colleague writes back, you know, I'm following your sage advice, we won't do it. And compare and contrast that with her testimony that she didn't know much about Burisma. And it further confirms, because we already have other evidence of this, that the Obama State Department knew full well about Burisma. Mm-hmm. And other information shows they knew full well about Hunter Biden's involvement in this. So remember, this email traffic's going on while Biden's involved in Burisma directly. And, you know, and so President Trump gets impeached for asking about Biden corruption. The DOJ knew about it at the time in the sense that they were investigating Biden. We're now here, at least to Hunter Biden. They suppressed it through the election, in addition to through the impeachment. And we get information given to us late in the game after the election by both the State Department and now, I guess, the FBI and Justice Department, that the Biden corruption story is as real as we've been saying.
Well, Tom, does the DOJ have any interest at all to find out whether a former ambassador was lying under oath about all this?
They have zero interest in investigating any of that. There's all sorts of testimony that should have been investigated. The handling of the classified phone calls between the president and the Ukrainian official, the leaking of that, the sharing of that with others improperly should have been investigated. The Justice Department and the FBI have been AWOL in virtually all the crimes in which President Trump is a victim.
Well, meanwhile, we don't know exactly what they're investigating with regard to Hunter Biden's relationship with a Chinese company that was very closely related to Chinese intelligence that apparently was doing money laundering or may have been doing money laundering. That's why the company ultimately failed, because it was found out about that. What can you tell us? What have you figured out that the DOJ, we know, by the way, that they've had Hunter Biden's computer, the one that was left behind at the PC company, for over a year. Why has there been nothing about that?
You know, they say they weren't investigating him or they were doing it. They weren't doing overt acts before the election because there's some rule that actually doesn't exist, that they're not supposed to do overt acts in a way that impacts an election, and that somehow covers the entire Biden family.
Which, of course, they did exactly the opposite in 2016, right?
Well, exactly. They were leaking the investigation to the Clinton campaign. Look, I don't believe the FBI was ever doing a serious investigation. Anything they were doing, they were kind of forced into doing. And to the degree they were doing anything, it was because of the heroic actions of Rudy Giuliani that forced their hand. I don't think the president can depend on the FBI and the DOJ to do anything these days, especially on these politically sensitive topics. And he should appoint a special prosecutor for Joe Biden. As far as I'm concerned, given the evidence, and I've talked with Rudy Giuliani about this in a separate interview, you know, he's highlighted there's more than enough evidence to justify an indictment already against Joe Biden, given the documentary and witness testimony that's already been out there.
Well, yeah, you mentioned the desire to have a special counsel. I mean, isn't that what you got in John Durham, who is about the slowest prosecutor in the West?
Well, you have someone who's outside the Justice Department do it. It should answer to the White House, not the Justice Department, which is compromised.
Who would you choose? I mean,
someone like Rudy Giuliani, who is not afraid.
Yeah.
Who's not afraid. And someone who's less interested in protecting
the problem is the last great prosecutor that I can remember, in fact, I mentioned him to John Solomon just a moment ago, was Bob Morgenthau, who was the DA in New York for many years. And he followed a track wherever it led. He didn't care what political party it happened to lead to. There just aren't that many people like that. The whole justice system has been so corrupted by what's happened at the DOJ over the past 12 years, really, that it's very difficult to find an independent prosecutor out there.
Yeah, the concern I have is that Obama ruined the Justice Department. The FBI was ruined by Mueller and Comey, and we still haven't recovered. And so they're not reliable entities in the meantime. And that's the rule of law crisis we face.
Yeah.
Nothing's been done about the Obamagate corruption, the worst corruption scandal in American history, practically speaking. And Biden was protected by these agencies while they were attacking Trump.
So what happens now? What happens if Joe Biden takes over in January? What happens to the Justice Department?
I think they'll go through the motions in investigating his family, and, you know, Biden will be free and clear.
Okay, so he won't have to pull out a pardon for his son or himself.
Yeah, I don't even think he'll have to exercise it.
All right. Tom Fitton, we're, again, like I said to John Solomon, we're glad we have independent journalists and investigators out there to look into the truth, because apparently we're not going to get it from DOJ. We thank you for coming on, Tom. Good to see you. And coming up next, a red storm rising, how China has been infiltrating American colleges and universities. Also, the very latest developments and reports linking Democratic Congressman Eric Swalwell to a Chinese spy. We'll take it up after a break with Congressman Devin Nunes. Censoring in order to protect their funding from the Communist Chinese Party. For more, we turn to Fox Business's Jackie DeAngelis. Jackie.
Earlier this week, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo talked about China's threat to U.S. security and free speech in a way most people might not expect on college campuses. Pompeo warned that U.S. colleges are basically bought by Beijing in several different ways, and that their funding creates a situation where universities censor themselves to avoid upsetting the People's Republic of China. According to a Bloomberg report, since 2013, close to $1 billion in gifts and contracts has come from Beijing. Roughly 115 colleges got the gifts, and Harvard took the lead. The other prominent universities on the list: USC, University of Pennsylvania, Stanford, and NYU. Now, there are several ways that China is funding U.S. colleges, and they don't always have to report it. There are also 400,000 students that come here to study from China. And while the students may not be compromised per se, they often get tuition funding from home. What that does is create a reliance on this stream of revenues by the universities. And the experts say that funding comes with strings and leaves us vulnerable.
There have been direct threats from Chinese consulates to American university leaders about the withdrawal of funds if, for example, the Dalai Lama gives a speech at the university, or if the university works with Taiwan in certain ways. So is this a dire, daily, widespread threat? No, but it's growing and it's real.
The Trump administration took a tough stance on China. The incoming Biden administration promised it would do the same. But the issue is tuition costs here in the U.S. are high. States don't provide enough funding to universities, and that's where the need for foreign revenue comes in. The hope is that the government can find a way to have some sort of filter for this, but at the current moment, there isn't one. David?
All right, Jackie DeAngelis, thank you very much. Well, breaking news also now from Republican Congressman Jim Sensenbrenner. He is calling on the House Ethics Committee to investigate Congressman Eric Swalwell and his relationship with suspected Chinese spy Christine Fangfang, or Fangfang. Sensenbrenner says that Swalwell is now compromised and should not be on the committee. Also breaking, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi doesn't seem very concerned about Eric Swalwell's involvement with a Chinese spy, despite his role on the House Intel Committee. Listen.
Well, I don't have any concern about Mr. Swalwell. There are those in the Congress who believe, and I am among them, that we should be seeing what influenced the Chinese. I've been fighting them, as you know, for over 30 years. But I don't know that it means that we have to background checks for every intern who comes into the Capitol.
Speaker Pelosi, however, has proudly pushed the debunked Trump-Russia collusion narrative, even after the president has been vindicated multiple times.
Just as I've said to the president, with him, all roads lead to Putin. I don't know what the Russians have on the president, politically, personally, financially, or whatever it is.
Joining us now is Congressman Devin Nunes, ranking member of the House Intel Committee. One just shakes his head at statements such as that from Nancy Pelosi. But as we look deeper into what was happening in California with Congressman Swalwell, it appears that he was right smack in the middle of a nest of spies. We went back and found a photograph from 2013. It was at the Chinese consulate in San Francisco, where there apparently is a lot of spying going on. And look there, in the middle is Fangfang. To her right, to our left, is none other than Russell Lowe. This is the longtime Senator Dianne Feinstein's staffer, who has been accused of relaying information to Chinese intelligence. And Swalwell was at this same meeting. Again, this was in 2013. And look at the top there. It relates to the story Jackie was telling us about Chinese infiltration of American colleges. It's the Chinese Student Association. They're the ones that tweeted this picture out. So it all comes together, doesn't it, Congressman?
I think that's right. And it's the old adage that whatever the left accuses you of doing, they're actually doing. So They ran around with talking about Russia, P-tapes, and Moscow prostitutes. And meanwhile, they knew the whole time that they have a China problem. And that's really the key here, David. I think people need to focus on and where the investigation really needs to go. How big is this spy ring in the San Francisco Bay Area, and what influence do they have over what is, arguably the leading progressive center of the universe? Seems like the Chinese are very well fanged in to the San Francisco area.
Nice little pun there. Now, Dan Hoffman, he is a former bureau chief for the CIA, retired now. He spoke earlier. As much as San Francisco should be on our radar, it's happening all over the country at institutions, whether they're college institutions or political institutions. I think we have that tape. Can you play that? Roll that tape from Dan Hoffman.
It's extraordinarily diverse and ubiquitous. If you think about Chinese intelligence officers, they're operating in Washington, D.C. and at the consulates in San Francisco and New York and Chicago and Los Angeles. They use all sorts of collectors and some very creative ways of stealing our secrets. They are, ruthlessly focused on conducting espionage in this country.
Again, Dan Hoffman was a bureau chief, a CIA bureau chief. He knows whereof he speaks. I mean, it seems clear that Swalwell has been compromised. Does he deserve to be on the Intel Committee?
Well, look, that's going to be ultimately up to Pelosi and the Democrats to decide whether or not he's going to be on next year or not. Then, if that's the case, we Republicans will have to conduct an investigation. So, look, I think what Dan Hoffman is saying is I'll take it one step further. There's no surprise that spying's going on in Washington and that spying's going on out of consulates, especially out of our adversaries. The question here is why did this for 4 years, Trump get accused and any Republican, including the Republicans on the House Intelligence Committee, being called Russian assets, but the media hasn't been held accountable. So I think this goes much deeper. It's not just about the pocket of the spy ring dealing with the Democrat progressives in San Francisco. It also is, what power do they have over the media? Like, for example, another example that you didn't use, David, the NBA. The NBA, they're all for doing good all over America, right. But when it comes to talking about the devastation that the Chinese Communist Party does on individuals and the censorship and the mistreatment of their citizens, the NBA says nothing about it. So the hypocrisy is quite large.
Well, in Hollywood allowing Chinese censors to edit their material. I mean, it's just extraordinary. Meanwhile, of course, we're close to the possibility of swearing in as president of the United States a man whose entire family seems compromised by the Chinese. The more we learn about that, isn't that distressing to you?
Well, look, that's the other issue. And it also, this once again goes back to the media and the big tech companies, right? The Hunter Biden laptop was covered up by nearly all the media in this country. 95% of the media didn't talk about it. And, then the links are not just that Hunter Biden had ties to Ukraine and Russia, but also to China. And I think China is probably the biggest problem. And I was listening to what Tom Fitton said, and I mentioned this the other day on Fox Business. I have zero confidence that the FBI and DOJ are going to do a damn thing about this. I'll be shocked if they do, because, and here's why. They knew about Biden's problems and the Biden family's problems for many, many years. For many, many years. They knew about the Biden problems during the impeachment hoax of President Trump. So confidence level is very, very small.
Well, President Trump is still the president, and he can appoint a special counsel to look into all this. And then, of course, it would be up to Biden whether he wants to fire a special counsel who's looking into his son and possibly him, which would look pretty awful. But do you think the president should do that?
I do, and I've called for that. I think there's no path forward, and it's just because of what we know over the last 5 years. I mean, I don't have a Republican colleague that I work with, nor do I have any constituents that are conservative to Republican that trust the DOJ or FBI. And that's a big problem.
By the way, are you going to be joining your colleagues in signing an amicus brief with this case that may be going to the Supreme Court on the election?
Yeah. I think that was, I think just this morning. We just found out about it yesterday.
Okay. And very quickly, there's been this rumor going around that you had COVID because you tested positive for antibodies. What's the latest on that?
Well, no good deed goes unpunished. So let me start with, if you have the COVID antibodies, if you have an antibody test, a blood test, we're in desperate need at the blood centers across the United States of America because this blood plasma can be used to treat very sick and ill patients that are in the hospital. So
like the president took a shot of that.
Yeah, so I tested positive for the antibodies. And so I went today, gave blood. I'm going to put out a little video on it. We actually gave blood plasma. And this is what all Americans should be doing. And then I went on a big local talk radio show here in my district to talk about it, to encourage people to give blood. Right. And lo and behold, the fake news, it went viral all over the world. They jumped on real quick that I would tested positive, for the virus, which was not true.
No, but it's extraordinary that you had the antibodies. So many people have been infected by this thing, didn't know about it because there were no symptoms at all, and now they have the antibodies. It's an extraordinary thing. We got to leave it there, Congressman. We'd love to have you back. Thank you very much for being here. Coming up next, Virginia's Governor Ralph Northam wants you to stay home for the holidays and forego religious services. We're going to be asking